left Edison High School because we were presented with an opportunity. There was a gentleman that was clearing out all religious programs out of schools in the Huntington Beach School District. So we went out to see in the close proximity area a school that would accommodate us on a weekly basis. And Estancia happened to be a school that would let us meet in their building every single week.
And Estancia has a quad that doubles as a cafeteria, and the quad is already kind of set up. You just need to add some chairs to the chairs they have. The stage is already built in. Putting up the speakers and all is a lot easier because we moved about 3 to 5 miles away, you know, depending on whether you go by street or how the crow flies. You're attracting a whole new group of people who are in that realm or radius of influence. Now we go to Estancia, we have a presence there. We're starting drawing from that part of the community, and there's a new influx of people. And it's really a great setup for what we're trying to do. It had a lot of positive momentum in that way.
A permanent location was always on our radar. We were looking at every piece of property that we could possibly dream about being able to afford. Nothing seemed to work out. And fortunately for us at the time, it didn't work out because we were going to be presented another challenge in the near future.
Two years into Estancia, what had happened is all the guys that started the church with me and were on staff with me ended up moving to other staffs, getting opportunities. Like one of our singles guy went to Willow Creek in Chicago, which is a huge mega church. And Pierre had an opportunity to move from a youth pastor to be a senior pastor, and he went up to Washington. At the same time, Tom had to move his factory out of state. And he then took not just his factory, but a lot of guys that we had evangelized who went to his factory. Well, what I learned is when we replaced these people, they didn't share the same vision. They didn't have the same background. They didn't know who I was from Adam other than this is the guy that's up front speaking. And so all the assumed understanding of what we're about, what our culture is, what we value, what we're trying to accomplish, none of these new people have it. And so what had happened is we had a whole group of people who didn't share the same vision.
Clark was just agonizing over this whole thing because he felt like God woke him up in the middle of the night, is the way Clark explained it to me, and said, you know, you got to do something about this. So he set up a meeting with him and Kent and the guys and maybe an elder or two or something like that. And his idea was either talk these guys into staying or let's just do a church plant. Kent had always had a vision of planting a bunch of churches, and this would be our first one.
But the church plant ends up becoming a church split because now you realize if we plant a church and it's local, who's going to go where? And so friendships began to be torn apart and people began to bicker, and then you had to have a reason for going because there was no vision for the church plant. The church plant was to let the other guys fulfill their philosophy of ministry, which might be different than our philosophy of ministry. So basically the church splits into three pieces. Those who stay at Beachcities, those who go to the church plant, and those who say, I'm done with God, I hate politics, I hate this kind of stuff, I'm not going to church anywhere, church stinks, it's full of a bunch of hypocrites and infighting and ugliness. And that's exactly what happened, a third.
Kent, I think, took the brunt of the attack because he was the leader, and here he is thinking one day that he's been put there by God, and then some guys tell him, no, we are. And they were the ones mistaken.
Well, through this process is obviously extremely painful because I become the epicenter of everything. And so what all the conflict is about is are we going to follow Pastor Kent or are we not? So it really is going to boil down to me. So I become the center focus of all the good and all the bad. And that's miserable. I'll just tell you right now, that is miserable. It's a horrible place to be. It's deeply discouraging. You don't want to defend yourself, and all your friends are tired of defending you. And so my intention was to quit. So I thought, okay, I need to talk to a friend of mine. I was on a board of a missionary.
Alberto Motesi is a South American Billy Graham, and Kent happened to be working with him and as a young voice on one of his boards. And during this painful experience, God impressed on him to go seek counsel from Alberto Motesi.
So I'm talking to him, and he says, stop. And I said, okay. He said, let me ask you 2 questions. I said, what? Have you committed any sin that would disqualify you from ministry? Have you been involved in any sexual misconduct, any stealing of any church funds, involved in anything like that? I said, no. Are you teaching false doctrine? Are you preaching a false gospel? Are you doing anything? I said, no, not doing that either. You know, I'm not perfect, but I'm not doing that stuff. And he says, okay, then you're the shepherd. And I thought, well, yeah, I know, I'm trying to resign that. And he goes, no, that's not what I mean. He says, last night, my wife had a dream in which God spoke to her. And she said that a shepherd would come to me today and that he was going to abandon the sheep and that I was to tell him he cannot leave because the sheep will be scattered. And if he leaves, the rest of his life, he will go from flock to flock and he will wander and never be a shepherd. You have to stay. God wants you to stay in that church. And I thought, this is the worst news I've ever heard. But at the same time, it was the most encouraging. And he said, the last thing I'm supposed to tell you is that God loves you. He loves you dearly. Stay there and serve those sheep. And so I said, all right, I gotta stay. And I really wanted to run. I just didn't want to fight this battle. I went home and I got beside my bed and I got on my knees, and I don't usually pray on my knees like that or anything. And I said, God, this is the most painful thing I've ever done in my life. But if more pain will bring you greater glory, then pour more pain into my life so that I can glorify you through this, I'll do whatever you ask me to do. And I had no idea there was more pain to come. God fulfilled that prayer, so be careful what you pray for. But it was worth it because it began to change things in me that made me more effective. What ended up happening, I was at the point of exhaustion after all of this. And so the elders said, hey, there's a counselor in Colorado who specializes in dealing with pastors. Why don't you go visit him? And so that's what I did. I met with this guy, and then he gave me a lot of great stuff and encouragement, and then said, I think you're ready to go back into ministry. I think that this burnout's going to be behind you. We're going to find out for sure, though, because I have a guy who's a church consultant, who's a friend of mine, and I'm going to contact the elders at your church and see if you can spend another 2 weeks with him. So as a result of that, we put together a game plan to put the church back on a growth pattern, and then he met with a counselor in Colorado Springs, and they put together a multi-page document that they submitted to the elders with the recommendation, hey, make sure Pastor Kent's here, this is what we recommend, he's fit for ministry, he's great to go, move forward.
We stepped back into church and Kent back into preaching to a much smaller flock. And I know for Kent it was disappointing. But as a wife, you get the turmoil that's happening inside your man. And sometimes Kent would lean over to me and whisper things, and his voice was filled with resentment that gosh, nobody's here. And the exact words of what was on his heart, I can't tell you. But he was grumbling and he was complaining.
And I'm sitting in the front row and we're doing worship and I'm just really sad. And Linda finally leans over to me and she says, when are you going to stop mourning the people who left and start loving the people that are here with you?
And for whatever the words were that God gave me that day, they sunk in and they stayed with him. So thank the good Lord that he gave me those words and that Kent was going to be able to listen to him.
And I just felt so convicted. That's exactly right. What a terrible, unbelievable shepherd I've been to mourn the loss of those who are gone, which is painful, and not love those who stay. Estancia is now the perfect size since the church is not nearly as big as it was, and I have to sharpen my focus. And so what happens is I hear about this guy named John Maxwell, and John Maxwell's this expert on leadership, and he's a pastor who begins to teach leadership to organizations, and I began to read his material and learn how to be a better leader. And then I find out that his number 2 guy at his church, a guy named Dan Ryland, mentors people who are senior pastors and to help them grow churches.
Kent asked Dan Ryland to mentor him for a year, and Dan Ryland agreed. And through that mentorship came so much good in Kent's leadership, in his style of relating, in programs, smart leadership programs that took effort, but programs that you would never even know to build, that were gonna build the structure of a church, that was gonna build strength, leadership, mentor leaders in the church for decades to come.
We finally got it back on track. In the overall picture, it turned out to be a good thing. Made us much wiser, much stronger, much more loving.
If I could summarize the Estancia years, I would say it was a time of tremendous spiritual growth. As this is a core group of people that have been in the trenches together, came through this church split, were loyal and bought into the vision of helping people to find Christ and grow.
So what ended up happening is when this gets all over, I'm talking to Clark and had been talking to Clark every week, getting together, rowing around Newport Harbor in his wooden boat. We would always talk about what's missing. There's something missing in our church. There's something missing, and I don't know what it is. And the central thing out of which everything grew, I think, was a recognition that people are entitled to fail and then have the opportunity to be restored. And that's the element that was missing, and I call that grace. That's what grace is all about.